In the middle of the Great Lake, where the salty waters mingled with reeds and mud, something impossible was happening. On a barren rock, a cactus defied logic, sinking roots where nothing should grow, and on the cactus, an eagle rested. In its beak, a serpent struggled, trapped between heaven and earth. For any other people, it would be just a moment of nature. For the Mexica, it was the signature of the divine. It was the confirmation that 200 years of pilgrimage, honor, and humiliation had not been in vain. The prophecy of Huitzilopochtli, the cruel god who had expelled them from their homeland, was finally being fulfilled. But to understand what it meant to stand before the eagle, it is necessary to first understand what it meant to be a people who had no place in the world, a people who carried their god like a burden and a sword, a people who learned in the worst possible way that the rejection of men can be as lethal as the fury of the gods. This is the story of how the Mexica, the Aztecs, found their home in the most unlikely place on earth, and how that home almost destroyed them before it even existed. To understand their arrival, we must go back to the beginning, not to the beginning of the world, but to the beginning of their wandering. The Mexica did not appear out of nowhere. They came from a place called Aztlán, the land of the herons, a mythical region located in the north on the uncertain borders between what is now Mexico and the southwestern United States. Aztlán was not just a land, it was a memory. In accounts passed down through generations, elders described a place of abundance where the water was sweet and the game was plentiful. But the Mexica were no longer welcome there, for reasons that the codices do not clearly reveal, perhaps overpopulation, perhaps internal conflicts, perhaps a simple divine order. They were compelled to leave. The agent of this expulsion was Huitzilopochtli. His name means left hummingbird or hummingbird of the south, an apparent contradiction. A hummingbird is delicate, but this one was a god of war, of the scorching sun, of sacrifice. He spoke to the priests through dreams and visions, and his order was simple and relentless. You will not stay here. I will lead you to a promised land, but first you must suffer. And so, around 1111 AD, the Mexica began a migration that would last more than 2 centuries. Imagine a slow caravan, entire families, warriors with straw shields, priests carrying the Tenochtli, a sacred burden containing the essence of the god, which no one could touch under penalty of death. They carried with them seeds, memories, and an unwavering certainty. Suffering was a path, not a punishment. Over the decades, they stopped in dozens of places. Each stop was an attempt to settle down. Each fixation was thwarted by a new sign from the god, ordering them to move forward. They crossed deserts, mountains, valleys. They saw peoples flourish and fall, and slowly the north was left behind. Destiny pushed them south, to the heart of Mesoamerica, to the Valley of Mexico Basin. When the Mexica finally descended into the Valley of Mexico in the beginning of the 13th century, they found a world already occupied. The lake basin, Texcoco, Xochimilco, Chalco, was one of the most densely populated regions on the continent. City-states flourished on the shores of the water. Azcapotzalco, the powerful capital of the Tepanecs, Culhuacan, heir to the Toltec tradition, and Texcoco, a center of knowledge and art. These were stratified societies with pyramids, complex calendars, and irrigated agriculture. In the eyes of the Mexica, they were established civilizations, and the Mexica, with their fur clothing, their rough language, and their nomadic customs, were seen as barbarians. Chichimecas, they called them with contempt, people of the desert, stray dogs. The political tension was immediate. No kingdom wanted those foreigners within its walls. The Mexica were useful only as disposable labor or as mercenary warriors in other people's conflicts. They were pushed to the margins, to the arid slopes, to the swamps where no one else dared to live. But they survived. They learned. They observed. It was during this period that a crucial phenomenon occurred: cultural absorption. The Mexica, despite being despised, recognized the sophistication of the established peoples. They began to adopt elements of Toltec culture, writing, architecture, rituals. There was a silent ambition growing. One day they would not only imitate those who rejected them, they would surpass them. But the rejection had deeper layers. Around 1300, the Mexica established a vassalage relationship with Culhuacan, one of the most prestigious cities in the region. They served as auxiliary warriors, and in return, they received permission to live on marginal lands. It was then that their leaders made a decision that could have changed their destiny, and that instead nearly exterminated them. Tenochtitlán of Culhuacan, Achitometl, had a daughter. The Mexica, seeking legitimacy, asked for the princess's hand in marriage to their god. Achitometl interpreted this as a request for a dynastic alliance. His daughter would become queen of the Mexica, uniting the lineages. He agreed. But the Mexica didn't want a queen. They wanted an offering. In their theology, the princess was to become the incarnation of Tochi, the goddess of the earth and fertility. In a secret ritual performed at night, they sacrificed her, and then a priest wore her skin. It was the ultimate consecration. The goddess wore the flesh of the princess. When Achitometl was invited to his daughter's enthronement ceremony, he entered the temple expecting to see her crowned. Instead, he saw a man wearing his daughter's flayed skin. The scream of horror echoed throughout the city. The massacre was immediate. The Culhuacans, enraged, fell upon the Mexica with uncontrollable fury. Hundreds were killed. The survivors were expelled to the swamps of the lake with no right of return. Now they were not just unwanted foreigners, they were cursed, ritual murderers who violated the most sacred of trusts. The psychological tension of this episode cannot be underestimated. The Mexica carried this guilt for generations. In their own accounts, they do not deny what happened. On the contrary, they record it as a necessary mistake, a misunderstanding between different worlds, but the wound remained. No kingdom would accept them after that. The swamps remained, and it was there, in the most hostile place, that they learned the most important lesson. Survival is not a given, it is an invention. Forced to live on mud islands, the Mexica developed techniques that would become legendary. They built enclosures of reeds and wicker, filling them with silt from the bottom of the lake. On this unstable base, they planted corn, beans, and squash. The first chinampas were born, the floating gardens that would one day feed a metropolis. They ate what the lake offered: fish, larvae, spirulina algae that dried under the sun and turned into a kind of blue bread. They drank water filtered by sand barriers. They learned to see the swamps not as a punishment, but as a potential granary. And while they survived, they waited. They waited for the sign.
The priests consulted the stars. The offerings multiplied, and Huitzilopochtli, silent for years, finally spoke. The vision came to an old priest during a dream. The god described the place precisely: a small, almost invisible island in the middle of the western lake. There, a rock emerged from the waters. On the rock, a nopal, a cactus, grew against all odds, and on the cactus, a golden eagle, wings spread to the rising sun, devoured a serpent. It was not just a sign, it was confirmation that the journey had an end. The Mexica set off in search. They traveled the lake in fragile canoes, scouring every island, every reed bank. Days turned into weeks. Hope began to dwindle. Until, on a silent morning, they sighted it. The island was small, muddy, infested with snakes, exactly the kind of place any people would avoid. But in the center, a rock. On the rock, a cactus, and on the cactus, the eagle. The sun beat down on its wings. The serpent struggled uselessly in its beak. The Mexica fell to their knees. 200 years of pilgrimage ended there.
The lake water, once a symbol of isolation and danger, was now the mirror reflecting their triumph. The prophecy was fulfilled. In the year 1325, the Mexica planted the first stakes in the mud of that island. They founded Tenochtitlan, the place of the rocky cactus by the water. They built reed huts. They erected a simple altar to Huitzilopochtli. They divided the land among the families. They began to expand the chinampas, transforming swamp into fertile soil. They found a home, but they chose the most unlikely place possible, a small, almost invisible island in the middle of the western lake. Without sources of fresh water, without natural defenses beyond the lake itself, surrounded by powerful enemies who still looked upon them with contempt. And why would Huitzilopochtli lead them precisely there? The answer is the key to everything that would come next. The god did not want a comfortable people. He wanted a warrior people. The fragility of Tenochtitlan was not a weakness, it was a forge. Without land, they would create land. Without allies, they would make war their diplomacy. Without power, they would take it by force. But the founding of the city was not the end of the journey. It was the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase. Because now they were no longer nomads. They were sedentary. They were settled. And that made them vulnerable. The cities around the lake watched that island with curiosity and suspicion. Did a people of outcasts dare to build a home in its waters? Did a people who sacrificed the daughter of a king dare to prosper? The question hanging over the fishermen's canoes, over the reed huts, and over the still bloodied altar of Huitzilopochtli is not whether the Mexica will survive. They have already proven that they know how to survive. The question is, how long until their neighbors decide that this small, insolent island is too great a threat to be ignored? And when that day comes, the Mexica will discover whether faith in a warrior god is enough to win real wars.